All right, what is going on, everybody? Better late than never. We've got the December 2023 top ops dissected. As always, I tweeted out what I thought the top ops were, and so yeah, I really think it was kind of a slower end of the year. I think 2023 overall was a more difficult year. I think on an average 10-year span, that's probably maybe a 3 out of 10, maybe a 4 out of 10. I think there's been slower years. Like, I don't think it was necessarily so slow, especially March. I mean, March was like an 8, maybe even a 9.
The collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. The second biggest bank collapse in U.S. history.
The Silicon Valley Bank collapsed on March 10th.
March was incredible, but there were definitely some slower times and a lot of trappy times. There were a lot of places that were extremely dangerous, one of which was the landmine in ZJYL, which we will discuss. But I do think the crypto stocks provided some high potential setups, and definitely at the start of this year, those crypto stocks have made up for it, which I'll kind of do a separate video on. But nevertheless, here are the ops, and now we're going to dive in. So first was the FIVN on December 4th. They were weighing a sale. For the most part, I don't want to dive too much into interpretation of these M&A headlines. I'm going to save that for a future video. And for the most part, I think many people would be better off not being an analyst and not trying to analyze and interpret these headlines, but more so think of them as binary. If new, I need to execute my system. You want to get into that as quick as you can, then just simply hold to prior bar lows. The system is simple, but it is powerful. And in a lot of these M&A headlines, as you'll even see, there was another one this month in the DOCU, it just tends to be very, very effective. It's kind of like we've seen very textbook. I will eventually share more thoughts on the nitty gritty, but like the way bigger point for you all to realize after seeing enough examples of these already is you can trade breaking news very, very effectively with a very simple system. Yes, you need to know which headlines are a big deal. Yes, that requires some context. Yes, that requires taking very good notes and kind of being aware of what's moving stocks and doing your research. But if new M&A headline, which of course weighing sale is 99 out of 100 times a positive, if it's new, of course, you want to buy as quick as you can and just implement that simple system. This Nikola on 12-6, this is another breaking news headline. Much like what we saw in AMC the prior month, this is an offering of shares and converts. This came after hours. This is a very liquid stock. Many people might scoff at this, but you can do some really nice damage based on the volume that this thing was doing. Again, it went in that beautiful straight line. It held prior bar highs the whole time. And that cover is another place where if you wanted to, you could have even potentially flipped long. I don't feel the need to flip long there just because we weren't so extended, but we do have kind of the biggest volume bar. Nevertheless, that short ends up like a super easy layup. So when people ask me, what do I consider an easy money trade? This Nikola is exactly the base case of what I consider an easy money trade for a breaking news trader. It didn't move too fast. The headline was fairly straightforward and it really just trended beautifully and is super liquid. So this is the type of thing that, like, if you're a new trader, there's no reason why you can't make 500 bucks in this. Then that 500 can become 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 over time. It's just a beautiful, simple offering that we see again and again. And I think what's nice is having done almost maybe 6 of these now is you all get a feel that while we make trading very hard, and it can be very hard, a lot of the best plays each month are exceptionally straightforward. This is no different than some of the converts we saw in Rivian, or I think Neo was that other convert and an offering we discussed, and even the AMC share offering. So now we're going to CRISPR, CRSP on 12-8. This was a little bit of a more difficult situation. And so what happened is these are essentially the CRISPR therapy of adjusting genes. And this had its FDA PDUFA date. And so what happened is these names, it was CRISPR, it was Blue, and I believe it was even also the Vertex drug, if I'm not mistaken, but they were awaiting approval. Approval was expected. So it's not so much, oh my God, it got approval, buy. So often with these biotechs, the devil is in the details. And with these, approval was expected, but was more so what kind of warnings will these stocks get? This CRISPR, CRSP, this did indeed get a safety warning. And so if you can see that, of course, being early to short is really, really nice. And I'm just going to give that the typical stop of prior bar highs. I don't love that rollover at 1140. I don't think it's the worst thing ever, but I don't love it because it's already been a decent sized move and it's been a little bit rangy, and I wish we had a little bit longer, tighter consolidation. So I don't hate it, I don't love it. If it were me, I don't think I would have necessarily taken it, but it did indeed work pretty well and hold prior bar lows. Then the other thing I wanted to point out with that second trade circled on there is that turn at 63. From a chart perspective, I don't really love this at all, but what I did want to point out is if you are watching the box or watching the ticks on this, there is a very clearly identifiable seller at 63. And so when you see that really tight bar that I have circled there, what that is that red bar is essentially that seller holding the stock down as it's trying to bounce. Then sure enough, that seller gets taken and he lifts. That's the type of situation where you can consider having a buy stop in and buying right above once that seller breaks, and then just giving the traditional stop. You don't really make out too well on this. You end up getting just a couple points, but I more so wanted to highlight, so often when I talk about reading the tape and reading the box, that's the type of thing where even though this intraday wasn't such an amazing buy just based on the chart, but the level 2 can really play a factor there where you recognize, oh wow, the stock is trying to bounce, it's being held down by the seller, we're super tight against it, tight. Boom, seller breaks, you're off to the races for a couple points. So that's the big thing I wanted to point out there. Where the bigger opportunity was on this was really in Bluebird Bio. This name got FDA approval, but they got the black box warning. And for those of you that aren't familiar with FDA stuff, the black box warning is really not good. That's pretty much the highest safety restriction you can get, the highest safety warning you can get. Oftentimes having a black box warning can really impair sales. And so this sells off, then we go limit down as people catch on, and this melts the stock. Because essentially, if you have CRSP and these other drugs that are getting FDA approval and don't have the black box warning, it's pretty much super unlikely that any doctor would recommend or prescribe the riskiest of them. So that essentially means Bluebird is essentially screwed, right? Most of these biotechs tend to have kind of one product or one drug. And so when you get that black box warning and your drug is then inferior to the others on the market, it is really bad news for you. So that ends up being a beautiful short. The typical stop of prior bar highs works exceptionally well. People might be thinking to themselves, how do you become more informed on catalysts like this? Bloomberg has a biotech calendar. That's one great way. There's people on Twitter that tweet some of this stuff. There's Bio Run-Up on Twitter, and I think they might have a paid subscription where they have these catalyst calendars. And that's the type of thing where, as an office in Chicago, we would really be tracking all these events. Sometimes these approvals can come out before the PDUFA date, but in general, it's a good bogey to have your eye on and to have prep and just to know what the expectations are. I think at some point I might be able to share some FDA and biotech notes that I've taken and was able to recover from the past. So if I can dig those up, I'll share those because it covers stuff like this exact situation. Moving on, we've got a play in natural gas. I don't think this play was so amazing, but I thought it was pretty okay. And before we analyze it, we need to look at the daily. And what we can see is that natural gas was selling off super hard for the month of November. We effectively lost almost a third of the price over the course of the month into December and everything. What happened was then over the weekend, we got a really crappy weather forecast, meaning it was warmer than expected. And so natural gas was gapping down. Then as you're gonna see, we're going to end up blowing out pre-market and off the open. The other thing I wanted to point out is this kind of capitulation pretty much was the near bottom. I did swing just a little bit of this and I got stopped out like kind of right at the lows below like 2 days later, which kind of sucked because then obviously we bounced huge, but that's fine. But nevertheless, the intraday still proved extremely profitable. And what we ended up was pre-market going into the open, we were in a super steady range at around 238. Then this was already a decent gap down, but then we just totally puke. And we go from 238 to 230, which doesn't seem like a lot, but that's kind of a 4 or 5% move in addition to that gap down. And so what I did is the just very basic right side of the V. I bought the turn in that. The other thing I would say is this had come up in one of the AMAs. I think also posted about this somewhere, but I don't recall. But what I would also say is it's totally fine to catch that first leg on the bounce. I was also still holding some big picture because this this was just such a huge move on the daily. What I would say is when we go back down towards those lows after such a strong bounce, like the angle of that bounce is almost straight up. So then when we go back down and test those lows again, that's a beautiful place to re-add or to reestablish or to add more against those lows. The bet is just so asymmetric. So eventually I sold some on the turn of prior bar lows, but I was keeping some as a core. Then I was able to add it all right back, just risking 1 penny. And on that 1 penny, I ended up making probably, I don't know, like I sold a chunk towards the close and overnighted the rest that I then later got stopped out on, like I pointed out before. But that's super asymmetric, and that ends up being a super cool trade. Point being here, you really need to think like once we kind of put in a bottom, like in something like the shot intraday that one day, you really need to be open to making kind of that higher low or that lower high, whatever the case may be, and recognizing that as an opportunity. If anyone wants to further research this, one of the plays discussed in one of the AMAs, it was ticker Golf Oscar Foxtrot on the daily, where this had a huge capitulation that then put in a higher low, and then it was off to the races. So that's something I wanted to bring up with this play. Another M&A headline, this was 4 on December 14th, and what this was a headline that GPN was exploring a takeover of 4. This was a little bit slower to move. These are kind of just, I believe, more payment processor stocks, so I wouldn't have some crazy expectation on this, but nevertheless, decent opportunity there. Yes, you get stopped out, and yes, it keeps on going another couple points. That is totally fine, right? Like this system is never going to work perfect all the time, but it's just in the aggregate trying to get the best outcome. Again, I'm not trying to interpret these headlines too much for the scope of these videos. That's something I kind of want to dissect a little bit more in the future, but for now we're going to leave it there. This headline did end up getting denied by GPN overnight, but that's fine. Actually, the other thing I would say for that, anytime there's M&A during the day, you always want to be prepared for the denial. Thinking back to the Humana Cigna takeover, where then Cigna ended up abandoning talks and ending talks, you need to be ready for that headline to come out during market hours. In the case of Cigna and Humana, that happened days later. In the case of this one, this happened overnight, but sometimes those headlines happen during market hours, and those can be incredible opportunities. So you always want to be game planning and thinking, what if? What could the next subsequent headline be? Maybe it could be GPN in advanced talks and deal could come as soon as this week. Maybe it could be GPN ends all talks or denies the talks. You definitely want to be game planning for those. You want to set alerts and you want to be prepared. Now we're going to look into good old DocuSign on December 15th. Again, this was another M&A headline. We have seen M&A really heat up over the last month or two. That tends to happen with the bull market and the relief of some of the financial worries and the rate fears. And so same as always, you want to try to get to that headline as quick as you can. And then you're just going to simply do the prior bar lows. And that ends up catching you a really nice leg in something that had a lot of liquidity. So again, I really hope you're just recognizing that I'm not trying to be the analyst for the intent of these videos, and I'm just applying a very simple system again and again and again. And the results can be really fantastic when applied in the right places. This is just another M&A headline, right? So now if you think about it, if you take a step back, two major categories we've seen multiple times is M&A and the share offerings. And those are some of the lowest hanging fruit to kind of sharpen your teeth as a budding breaking news trader. Those are all really opportunistic. There's a lot of money in them, and they just tend to be very replicable and predictable. So I think for people that are trying to expand into this, this is all stuff well worth documenting. Again, every single headline, you always want to read the news stories. You always want to think about this stuff critically and think, why does a stock go up when you're exploring sale? Why does a stock go up when someone has approached you? Why do stocks go down on these share offerings? Why on these converts? And just think critically and start to really document this. How much do they go up? What percents? What sector were these M&A occurring in? What might be the next stock to explore a sale or get M&A interest? So that's something to just really think about. Another ticker I wanted to bring up, this is definitely an under the radar play. I can't imagine anybody on FinTwit is looking at this stuff, but it is ticker Mike Yankee Oscar, MIO. And this is kind of just a smaller cap stock that kind of just puked out, just classic capitulation. This was weak on the daily. This is, again, just a beautiful place for the typical right side of the V. This isn't a home run by any means. Like, I don't think you're making 50 grand in this, but I think this is a really great place to make 500 bucks. The risk reward is pretty favorable, where I think you probably end up with roughly 2-to-1 reward to risk. And I think the odds of this bouncing is probably, I don't know, probably pretty damn good. Like even as high as 80%, you get some nice volume capitulation, super strong turn, and the usual stop does us pretty well. I think it's important to give a spattering of, wow, these are the really big ops that are crushable, but there's also a lot of small plays where if you kind of have those price spike filters and you're really paying attention, you can spot little capitulations that can help pad a day. Now we're going to jump to Coin and Mara. So I had already done a video on this in very high detail, sharing my thoughts. I think Coin and Mara and the crypto stocks had some of the highest expected value that we've seen in a while, but they did not set up perfectly. For more details on what I wanted to see and what I did instead, please check out that video I shared already. I will also do a follow-up video, as a lot has happened in these stocks since. We got the actual ETF approval, and these are still super in play and moving all over the place. So I'll do a follow-up on this and touch on that. Now, I would be remiss if I did not bring up ZJYL. This was maybe one of the biggest landmines I've ever seen in my career. And I sadly know a lot of friends that got super hurt in this. Many people across many firms, pro side, retail side. It wasn't so beyond the realm of imagination that something like this could gap, but I would say the magnitude of that gap, I mean, I can't even include a good chart just because, you know, the Bollinger Bands and everything end up so skewed because of where this opened, but the magnitude of that gap was just such a widowmaker, and I don't really have any great insights. Even if you watched the last video, I kind of almost prophesized a little bit that these things are hard to control your risk in and that you need to be sized down overall. But nevertheless, like even a couple thousand shares in this is super brutal. So what I would say is if you're riding that trend lower, once that reverses, like yes, that ended up gapping huge into the 20s, but like a stop is a stop. You don't really want to do the wait and pray game. And with these low floats, like we saw in RETO, like sometimes these can have crazy gaps once that squeezes and people get trapped. Would I ever have imagined that the risk was hundreds of points on this? Absolutely not. So I don't want to act like I'm some genius or this wasn't just some huge fluke, because it was. For many people, it was nearly impossible to get out in that halt in between in the 20s. There was very limited liquidity. So this was just like to some degree unavoidable other than sizing down. And like, it's very easy to always say that in retrospect with hindsight, but like I would have never imagined that this opened up and traded in the hundreds. My bigger thoughts is like, this displays that it's nearly impossible to control your risk in this type of setup. So keep in mind that in the hierarchy of risk, shorts are generally very dangerous versus a long, and then low float shorts are even more dangerous. And in this market where we've seen something like this, that just opens up the whole paradigm of what's possible. Because again, I have never seen a gap like that. Super brutal. Like people were citing, oh God, HKD and stuff, but HKD never did a gap like that. You know, HKD was totally trading. You could have always gotten out. This was unlike anything I've ever seen. Super brutal, and I mean, just a crazy fluke that was a widowmaker and took down a lot of people. So now going forward, if it were me, I don't need to be involved in any of these Chinese stocks at all from what was probably light size. I don't know. You can't find words that are gonna kind of do justice to some of this stuff other than, man, that's freaking brutal. So overall, that wraps up the rest of this. Any questions, let me know. Any comments, let me know. Excited to go over some of this stuff in 24. Excited to hopefully bring more videos on breaking news. So thanks for watching, and let me know what you think.